Our speaker tonight, Nathaniel Philbrick, is one of the finest popular historians working in America today. His beautiful prose, exhaustive research, and spellbinding storytelling have made his books constant bestsellers. The book that is the subject of tonight's talk, In the Hurricane's Eye, is the latest in a trilogy of works about the American Revolution. His previous two books on this subject are Bunker Hill and Valiant Ambition. I should also note that we are selling copies of this book in the narthex tonight, and Nat will sign copies of them after the formal talk. Nathaniel Philbrick's first book, the critically acclaimed international bestseller, In the Heart of the Sea, won the National Book Award for nonfiction when it was published in 2000 and was made into a film directed by Ron Howard in 2015. His 2007 book, Mayflower, A Story of Courage, Community, and War, won the Massachusetts Book Award for Nonfiction and was a finalist for both the Los Angeles Times Book Award and the Pulitzer Prize for history. Additionally, Nat is the author of The Last Stand, Sea of Glory, Ben's Revolution, Second Wind, Away Offshore, and Why Read Moby Dick. Please join me in welcoming Nathaniel Philbrick.
Well, thank you. I love coming to Worcester. The American, go Worcester. The American Antiquarian Society has been so important to my work, not only my work, but my father's work. My father is a retired English professor with a specialty in James Fenimore Cooper, and so I can tell you that the Antiquarian Society is truly a family tradition in the Philbrick family. And I miss the rotunda, but this isn't bad at all. So thank you for coming tonight. And yes, this is my third book about the Revolution. I have been writing about the Revolution for 8 years, as long as the Revolution took to fight. And it's been one of the most amazing journeys for me. Usually I write a book of history and then, for reasons I'm never quite sure of, go on a very different tack and have to completely change gears and go on in another direction. This has been different. This has been really digging into a time period. It began for me, I never thought I was going to write 3 books about the Revolution. All my books are, in one way or another, about communities of people under enormous stress, whether it's a crew of a whale ship that's just been rammed by a whale, 102 pilgrims on a leaky ship bound for a coast in winter about which they know nothing. And I live on Nantucket Island, a community of 15,000 year-round. We have a moat of 30 miles surrounding us. And I know from experience and growing and we've been there for 32 years now, if you live in a community of 15,000, you may not know everyone by name, but you recognize everyone. It's a very personal existence. And Boston, in the time of the Revolution, was an island. It bore absolutely no resemblance to what the city is today. It was a 1.1 square mile island connected to the town of Roxbury by a thin neck of land that in spring high tide was underwater. And there were 15,000 people on it. So I was just fascinated with what happened to this community under the enormous stress of a revolution. The Battle of Bunker Hill is obviously the climax of that book, but I found myself completely captivated by the gentleman who arrived a few weeks later, George Washington. Now, this was not the George Washington that stares at us from the $1 bill, that dour statue. This was George in his early 40s, red-haired, fiery by temperament, not yet the staid pragmatist, defensively minded general he would become. He wanted to end this war. He was not pleased with the New Englanders he had inherited, and he knew they didn't have any money, they didn't have enough gunpowder. He just wanted to attack British-occupied Boston and end it as quickly as possible. This was insane. He didn't have the men, he didn't have the ammunition, the equipment he needed to pull this off. And every time he brought this before his his council of war, it was voted down unanimously. This was a George I had to follow. Ultimately it would end when a bookseller, and God bless booksellers, when a bookseller by the name of Henry Knox pointed out that there were a lot of cannons in Fort Ticonderoga, at the southern tip of Lake Champlain. What if we went up there, got those, dragged them down, maybe we could dislodge the British. He would do it with his younger brother William, waiting till the snow made it possible to drag those cannons down on huge sleds over the Berkshires and down. And they arrived in Framingham, and a few weeks later, a few of those cannons were atop Dorchester Heights, and General William Howe realized he had no alternative but to evacuate. My second book about the Revolution is called Valiant Ambition, and it begins the summer of 1776. The empire has struck back, and this time New York is in its sights. Washington is dug into the high ground of Brooklyn Heights and New York City, as he watches as a huge British invasionary force arrives, 400 ships, 40,000 sailors and soldiers. That's more people in Philadelphia, the largest city in North America at the time. And what was Washington to do? It would not be his greatest hour. He would be completely outgeneraled by William Howe. He would save his army with a brilliant nighttime retreat across the East River, but soon he had surrendered New York and would ultimately end up on the Pennsylvania side of the Delaware River, his army completely shambled. This was bad, not because we had lost since we had lost New York to the British, but because the British now had a toehold on that corridor of water that reaches all the way to Canada, the Hudson River going straight north with a jog to Lake George and then Lake Champlain, a lake of river-like proportions that goes 100 miles into Canada. And just as Washington was losing New York, another large British invasionary force was poised to sail down the Lake Champlain, take Fort Ticonderoga, join with Howe, and this would isolate New England from the rest of the colonies, and that would be it for the American Rebellion. But there was one American general who stood in the way of the British, and his name was Benedict Arnold. Benedict Arnold is the focus of Valiant Ambition, along with Washington. And this would be Benedict Arnold's finest hour, the Battle of Valcour Island, in which Arnold would meet this large British force with a ragtag fleet of 15 boats, many of them he had helped build that summer. He would fight the British with such fury that they would ultimately decide to postpone the attack on Fort Ticonderoga, and America would be saved in the fall of 1776 thanks to Benedict Arnold. Valiant Ambition follows what happens to these two generals over the course of the next 4 years as we watch Washington become that indispensable man, the one person capable of holding the country together, while Arnold decides that it is his destiny to be the person who tries to pull it apart. Valiant Ambition ends in the late summer of 1780 when Arnold unsuccessfully attempts to surrender West Point to the British. Once again, it's all about water. This is before superhighways and railroads. The only way to transport an army or provisions was by water. And if Arnold had succeeded in surrendering West Point to the British and its 3,000 soldiers and its cannons and ammunition, that would have been the end of things. Because in the summer of 1780, the American Revolution, from an American perspective, had reached its lowest point. The American people had rebelled against Great Britain because we didn't want to pay them taxes. Well, we didn't want to pay the taxes required to fund Washington's army, which was withering on the vine. Recruitment levels were at disastrously low levels, embarrassingly low levels. It seemed as if the American people had turned their backs on the cause they had so fervently embraced in 1776. But Washington had hope. and the hope was with the French Navy. Thanks to Benedict Arnold's performance at Saratoga, and a few other people did admiral service in that battle, France had decided to join the American cause in the spring of 1778. They didn't do it because they loved America and its pursuit of liberty. They did it because they had been humiliated by Great Britain in the 7 Years' War, often referred to as the French and Indian War here in America in the previous decade. They had lost Canada, particularly their Navy had been completely outclassed by the British, which were historically the most powerful British and largest naval force in the world. Even before the 7 Years' War was over, France had launched on a program that they referred to as revenge. They launched a campaign to put England in its proper place and restore France's position in Europe. And they focused on the Navy. They realized the Navy was what they had to change. And so they instituted a couple of things. They built a naval academy in Brest, applying the Enlightenment ideals of applying rational principles to naval warfare. In England, officers were educated through experience. The French began to analyze naval tactics and created detailed tactical manuals that were very advanced for the time. They updated the signaling system. This was before radios and cell phones and things like that, and the way an admiral communicated with the captains in his fleet was with signal flags. The British had an outdated system that actually varied from fleet to fleet, so mistakes and confusion were almost inevitable. France came up with a very sophisticated numery system, and so this became clear in the spring of 1778, when the first clashes between the British and French Navy in these skirmishes. This was a different French Navy. Now, I think there's a tendency to think of naval warfare in the 18th century as kind of quaint and antiquated. You know, tall ships that look beautiful, but come on, they're nothing compared to the modern ships of the day. Baloney. A ship of the line. This meant that this was a huge naval vessel that fought side by side within its fleet, creating a line of battle that would then come beside the enemy's fleet in another line of battle and blast away at one another. It had evolved that the optimum size for a ship of the line was the 74. It had 74 cannons, capable of shooting cannonballs 20 to 30 pounds, more than a mile distance, but often it was just 50 yards between the two fleets as they went at each other. And so it took, to build 174, it took 2,000 oak trees. That's 56 acres of forest, between 500 and 750 men to man it. It could be out there months, close to a year at one time, without burning any fossil fuels. These were highly sophisticated technological machines, and Washington desperately wanted to get his hands on some of these. The American Navy had not come to much, and that was very frustrating. Yes, there was John Paul Jones, but his famous action off the coast of England really hadn't done much to help Washington. And what he needed was the French Navy to neutralize England's Navy. Up until this point, the British Navy had had a stranglehold on the Atlantic coast, meaning that whatever victories the Americans could win quickly came to nothing as the British fleet moved in. Just one ship of the line had more cannons than Washington's entire army in the beginning years of the Revolution. One of these comes into a harbor, and a community has no choice but to surrender. Washington had learned at the Siege of Boston that he could surround the British army, but if the British Navy had possession of Boston Harbor as it did, they always had a stream of provisions. And so he realized he needed to do something about this. And this is where the subtitle of my book refers to Washington's genius. And this was Washington. He had this ability to sort through the static of life and figure out what was the one mode of conduct that would actually change things. Initially, he realized that his aggressive behavior in the beginning of the war was unnecessarily risky. If he lost on the field of battle, that could be the end of it for the American cause. It was against every fiber of his being, but he realized he needed to fight a defensive war. A war of posts, he called it. This was Washington's ability to realize what he needed to do. And as soon as the French joined the cause in the spring of 1778, he realized what he needed was naval superiority, and it was going to be the French that did it. But up until the fall of 1780, he was completely stymied. Because the problem was with the entry of France, and along with them their ally Spain, which France needed if it was going to have a navy large enough to do battle with Great Britain. With the entry of these two countries into the war, what had been a colonial rebellion became a world war. And as soon as that happened, the dynamics of the conflict changed completely. We Americans, in our egocentric way, think of those 13 colonies or states, depending on your point of view, as the jewel in the empire's crown. It wasn't the case. It was the Caribbean, the Sugar Islands. That's where the real money was to be made. What we call Haiti now was responsible for a third of France's exports. I mean, these were where the money came from. And almost immediately, with the entry of France, the naval forces plunged into the Caribbean, and that's what was consuming their attention. They would Britain would take St. Lucia. France responded with Tobago. Back and forth it went, but the French fleet did not seem to be very interested in moving north and helping Washington. By the fall of 1780, Washington writes, "It is as if a chasm has sprung up between me and the French Navy. What are we going to do about it?" And he was growing desperate because he knew that if something didn't happen in the next year, France was going to throw in the towel. This was already going on much longer than they anticipated. They were running out of money. Something had to happen. And then, in the fall of 1780, things began to shift in the Caribbean. I never thought I would have a book called In the Hurricane's Eye come out in hurricane season, but it did. And yes, we had a pretty bad hurricane season this fall, but it was nothing compared to the hurricane season of 1780. My book begins with the British frigate Phoenix. A frigate is smaller than a ship of the line. It's faster. It has the ability to. It is the eyes and ears of the fleet. And the Phoenix had been sailing all around the Caribbean, keeping an eye on Spanish Cuba, because they knew what Spain wanted to do was attack Pensacola. The British had taken Florida in the French and Indian War, and Spain desperately wanted it back. And so the Phoenix was keeping an eye on Cuba and Pensacola, and it was sailing between Cuba and British Jamaica when the wind began to build. Now, this was before modern-day forecasting. This was before Jim Canteri shows up and you know that things are going to be happening from a weather point of view. And the wind began to build. First, they take in all their sails on the Phoenix, and they're forced to jibe back and forth in the channel between Cuba and Jamaica, terrifying as night comes on. The wind builds to hurricane force and beyond. They're forced ultimately to chop down the masts when a huge wave carries the ship stern first onto the rocky coast of southern Cuba, pounding it over and over again for hours at a time in the middle of the night. Finally, dawn comes. The ship is barely holding together when they realize they have only about 10 yards from the stern to the rocky coast. They throw out a line and they get everyone who's still alive on shore, and they make it. But, this has been a terrible storm, and it's just the beginning. This is from a few paragraphs from the first chapter, called the Building Storm. On October 10, what came to be called the Great Storm of 1780 hit the island of Barbados. By the following day, virtually every house, including those built of stone, had been leveled to the ground, and 6,000 inhabitants were dead. Many of the cannons at Fort James were hurled more than 100 feet through the air. The extraordinary surge of water and wind carried a ship so far onto shore that it landed on top of the island's hospital. The hurricane-whipped rain stripped the trees of bark, indicating that the winds at Barbados must have exceeded 200 miles an hour, literally power-washed the trees of bark. A similar scene of destruction occurred at St. Lucia, St. Vincent, and Martinique, where a convoy carrying several thousand French troops was blown out to sea. One estimate puts the total death count of the Great Storm of 1780 at 22,000, making it the deadliest hurricane in recorded history. And then, on October 18, 2 days after a Spanish fleet of 74 ships bearing 4,000 soldiers under the command of General Don Bernardo de Galvez departed from Havana to attack Pensacola, a third hurricane struck. Known today as Solano's hurricane for Jose Solano, the admiral in charge of the fleet, the storm ravaged the Gulf of Mexico for 3 days and ultimately drove the remains of the Spanish fleet back to Cuba. With dozens of vessels sunk and dismasted and hundreds of soldiers and sailors drowned, Solano and Galvez reluctantly decided to postpone the attack until the following year. The lesson was impossible to ignore. Given the seasonal dangers of the storm-battered string of islands, the best place for a navy in the summer and fall was anywhere but the Caribbean. Up until this point, France had viewed a naval expedition to the north on the behalf of the United States as a possibility, but hardly a priority. After that horrendous October, a different attitude prevailed. And thus begins a remarkable year that will climax with the great victory at Yorktown. Now, I grew up thinking of the Revolutionary War as linear, each battle as a stepping stone to God-ordained American victory. But as Washington came to realize, it wasn't that way at all. Things had cratered by the fall of 1780. There was no momentum. There was no natural progression. Washington had been locked in a stalemate with his British counterpart, Sir Henry Clinton, in New York. The British were dug in with more than 10,000 soldiers in New York City. Washington was to the north on the Hudson River, among the Hudson Highlands. He had been there for 2 years. He said the war drags on like a cart without wheels. What was going on was in the South, and it was not going well for the Americans. And summer of 1780, Horatio Gates, once the hero of Saratoga, had suffered an embarrassing, actually a humiliating defeat at the hands of Lord Cornwallis, a British general about whom we will be hearing later on as this year would progress. And to top it all off, in December of 1780, Sir Henry Clinton sends his newest brigadier general, the turncoat, Benedict Arnold, into the Caribbean with a small army. Arnold quickly proves that he might be the best battlefield general on both sides. He arrives like lightning, makes his way up the James River, has Richmond, the wartime capital of the state, assumed to be too far inland to be attackable. He has it in flames, sending wartime Governor Thomas Jefferson fleeing for his life. Washington is outraged and sends the young French officer who has become a kind of surrogate son to him, Lafayette, down to see what he can do about the hated Benedict Arnold in Virginia. Meanwhile, he sends I think the greatest unheralded hero of the American Revolution, Nathaniel Greene, the fighting Quaker from Rhode Island, down to deal with Cornwallis. It's amazing what goes on in the Carolinas that winter. Cornwallis burns his supply wagon so his army can catch up to the much smaller, bedraggled force of Nathaniel Greene, and they have a race across the diagonal across the Carolinas called the Race to the Dan, as Greene is able to make it into Virginia just in the nick of time. He then builds his army to the point that the two armies clash at Guilford Courthouse, not far from Winston-Salem, on a wooded hillside. It's one of the great battles of the American Revolution. Cornwallis claims victory because he has possession of the field at the end, but Greene has succeeded in eviscerating his army. Cornwallis will retreat to Wilmington, North Carolina, to build back his force, but he feels he must remain on the aggressive. He then moves into Virginia, replacing Benedict Arnold, and there he and Lafayette play a wonderful game of cat and mouse across the Tidewater. All this time, Washington is up there on the Hudson, very, very consumed with how do I get the French Navy up here. Unfortunately, his French counterpart, General Rochambeau, who with 5,000 soldiers and a very small fleet of ships of the line, has been located in Newport since the summer of 1780, but they've been stopped up by a British blockade that entire time. They haven't been doing anything. And Rochambeau has been given orders not to tell Washington where the fleet under Admiral de Grasse is located all that winter. The fear is that the American war effort is about to fall apart. And in that case, de Grasse has orders to sail to Newport and evacuate Rochambeau's army. Can you imagine if that had been the case? And so Washington is left in the dark all that winter and spring, and the tension is ratcheting up at his headquarters. I was surprised in this book at how emotional Washington is during this year. We think of him as that staid statue, but the pressures on him are immense after 6 years of war. At one point, he and Hamilton, the officer on his staff with whom he is the closest, have a violent argument. Washington says, I need you to come here. Lafayette is about to head south and stops Hamilton and talks to him for longer than Hamilton wants. So Hamilton is delayed in making his way up the staircase to Washington's second-story office. Washington is waiting for him in the stairs and says, Hamilton, you do me disrespect, sir. Hamilton responds, well, if that's what you think, we part. That's the end of their collaboration, one of the great collaborations of the war. Washington Hamilton assumes, well, that's the end of me having a meaningful command in the army. Washington is not that way. Not once would he would express his emotions, but never would he allow them ultimately to interfere with his better judgment. He would ultimately give Hamilton the position he deserved in the army that would eventually end up at Yorktown. Eventually, Washington reads in a newspaper that Admiral de Grasse's fleet is in the Caribbean. He confronts Rochambeau. So what's going on here? Rochambeau says, yes, by the way, yes, de Grasse is down there. And Washington has been, he's recently had a meeting with Rochambeau just outside Hartford at Wethersfield, Connecticut. And the decision was that they're going to focus on New York, the city of New York. That it's only there that there's a large enough British army that if the American-French fleet should be able to defeat them and there would be an Allied victory, only that would be large enough to potentially end the war. So at this point, Cornwallis has not settled into the end of that lonely point formed by the James and York River at Yorktown. There's no guarantee that any kind of movement to the Chesapeake will have positive repercussions. Rochambeau agrees with Washington, but tells de Grasse, I think you should go to the Chesapeake instead. On August 14th, Washington learns that de Grasse is sailing for the Chesapeake. He is extremely angry when he hears this. It's not the fact that he's not, he doesn't care if New York is not the primary focus, but he wants the fleet to at least sail to New York first so they can transport his army south to the Chesapeake. A 500-mile march into the torrid summer of the Tidewater is not what his New England soldiers want to do. Soldiers that have not been paid for years. How is he supposed to do this? And with de Grasse sailing to the Chesapeake, that's not going to happen. The two delegates to Congress who are with him when Washington receives the letter are like, wow, he's angry. A few hours later, when they meet for breakfast, Washington is completely calm. He's resigned himself to what he must do, and he says to the delegates, what can you do to help make this happen? And what unfolds is one of the most brilliant maneuvers of the Revolution, as Washington convinces Sir Henry Clinton that he's attacking New York, when all the time they're doing their best to sneak down to Philadelphia and on to Yorktown. Washington they're in Philadelphia, and Washington has, before Sir Henry Clinton realizes, oh my gosh, they're not going for me, they're going for Cornwallis, who by this point has dug into Yorktown. Washington continues on, but he has heard nothing about de Grasse. Where is he? Why hasn't he arrived yet in the Chesapeake? He's at the head of Elk, which is the top of the Chesapeake, when he gets a dispatch. De Grasse and 28 ships of the line have sailed into the Chesapeake. He turns his horse around and rides for Chester, Pennsylvania, where he knows Rochambeau and his entourage, who have been sailing down the Delaware inspecting American forts, are going to arrive. They see a figure on the waterfront. He's got a hat in one hand and handkerchief in the other, and he's jumping up and down and waving it back and forth. Now, this couldn't be Washington. No, he would never act that way. It is George Washington. He is absolutely ecstatic at this development. All the pressure of 6 years of war have culminated in this incredible event that he's been looking forward to for years. He hugs Rochambeau. Washington was not a hugger. And on they go. They pull into Mount Vernon. Washington has not been home for 6 years, for the entirety of the Revolution. He has 4 grandchildren he has never met before. He and Rochambeau spread out their maps on the dining room table and strategize about what is going to unfold at Yorktown. He's a few miles from Mount Vernon on his way to Williamsburg when he gets another dispatch. The British Navy has arrived off the entrance to the Chesapeake. De Grasse has sailed out to meet them. It's been several days, but there's been no word back about de Grasse. Washington is, according to his aide, very upset. On he marches, on he goes, not knowing what's going to happen. Now, it's known as the Battle of the Chesapeake. And we Americans think of Yorktown as the siege with which we won our independence. But I am here before you tonight to tell you the Siege of Yorktown was a fait accompli, and I think the term is appropriate, based on the fact that the French defeated the British Navy at the Battle of the Chesapeake on September 5th, 1781. I am not going to go into the details of what is considered, given its ramifications, ultimate ramifications, the most important naval engagement in the history of the world. I am not going to go into the details because that's why you got to buy the book. But the French prevail. This is the victory that makes Yorktown possible. De Grasse returns to the fleet. By this time, the small fleet from Newport has arrived, French fleet from Newport has arrived, and they have Yorktown surrounded as Washington and Rochambeau arrive with their French and American armies. The siege of Yorktown unfolds. In a matter of weeks, Cornwallis is forced to surrender. By preventing the British from rescuing Lord Cornwallis, because that was the intention of Admiral Graves, the British admiral who commanded the British fleet, Admiral de Grasse made our independence possible. And not in a single American participated in this. I think it's a very important lesson The genesis of our country is based on a foreign alliance. Without the French, we would not be here today. So many times during this book, I wanted Washington to have a high-five moment. Yes, we've done it. But during the Siege of Yorktown, his stepson, Jackie Custis, who had accompanied him to Yorktown, came down with camp fever. Within weeks of the great victory at Yorktown, Washington rushes to Jackie's side just as Jackie dies. While the rest of the country is in celebration, he and Martha are at Mount Vernon in mourning. And it will take another 2 years before the revolution finally ends with the evacuation of the British from New York City. It takes that long for the diplomacy in Europe to unfold, and it is then, this is one of the most harrowing times in our nation's history. Washington's officers hadn't been paid, and the Continental Congress, which did not have the ability to directly tax the American people, was without the means and to tell you the truth, the motivation to do them justice. By this point, they were dug into Newburgh, New York, on the banks of the Hudson, and what is known as the Newburgh Conspiracy would unfold, in which a group of Washington's officers said, it's time we marched on Philadelphia and forced the Continental Congress to pay us at gunpoint. This would have been the military coup that would have destroyed this Republican experiment called the United States of America. Washington talks his officers off the ledge. It's one of the most amazing incidents of his amazing life. He delivers a speech to his officers. His officers are unimpressed. And then Washington is 50 by this point. And like many people in his 50s, is beginning to have trouble reading. And so he has ordered up some reading glasses from Philadelphia. No one has seen him wearing these glasses. And after he delivers the speech, he pulls out a letter from one of... We went to the movies just before this, and I got some popcorn down there. Okay, so Washington delivers this magnificent speech. His men are unimpressed. He pulls out this letter from one of the delegates that is sympathetic to the officer's plight. And he begins to read, but clearly is having trouble reading the letters. And so he says, "Excuse me, gentlemen, I have not only gone gray in your service, I have apparently also gone blind." And he then puts on the glasses, and as every man in that room weeps, he reads the letter. After that, they agree that they will do as Washington requests and not march on Philadelphia. Finally, in November of 1783, the British evacuate New York. Washington has, most of his officers by this point have been dispersed. Most of them are very angry with him. It's not a beloved officer corps at this point, but there are a few very faithful officers who he has a very emotional farewell at Fraunces Tavern in Manhattan. He gets in a barge and makes his way to New Jersey, and then it's off to Annapolis. The Continental Congress is so fearful that their own army is going to attack them that they have fled Philadelphia and moved to Annapolis. This just proves to you how tentative our government was at this point, the barest window dressing of a federal government. It takes them 2 weeks to come up with the quorum needed for Washington to surrender his military commission to Congress. When King George hears that that is Washington's intention, to walk away from ultimate power, he says to the American-born painter Benjamin West, if he does that, he will be the greatest man in the world. And that is what Washington does. He walks away from ultimate power. He just wants to go home. I finished this book on Christmas Eve a year ago. And it's on Christmas Eve that Washington arrived at Mount Vernon, finally, after all this 8 years of war. It was a very different holiday for me. And I have to say, ultimately, this is called In the Hurricane's Eye, and I think the hurricane is the perfect metaphor for the year of Yorktown. Ultimately, it came down to a series of seemingly random events driven by forces beyond any single person's control. But ultimately, there was Washington fighting those centrifugal forces that threatened to blow this country to pieces. There was Washington, steadfast in the eye of the hurricane. Thank you very much.